Hello, everyone. Today we're going to dive into a deeply emotional story about trust, betrayal, and life lessons that no one could have predicted. An elderly man, full of hope, is swept into a heartbreaking scam. Get ready for a journey that explores sincerity, deep pain, and powerful realizations. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share it to spread this important message. Thank you for supporting the channel. Together, we'll share more meaningful stories like this one. Now, let's begin this heartfelt story. David Johnson, a 29-year-old security officer at Silverwind Airport, adjusted his uniform, smoothing out a wrinkle on his sleeve, and prepared himself for what he thought would be just another routine shift. The early morning sun cast soft beams through the expansive glass windows, illuminating the terminal as travelers trickled in. Each step echoed on the polished floor, the familiar symphony of rolling suitcases and hurried footsteps blending together in a steady hum. As David began his rounds, his practiced gaze scanned the crowd, settling momentarily on the mix of business professionals, families, and weary travelers making their way through the terminal. He was used to these scenes, the endless tide of arrivals and departures, reunions and farewells. Yet today, something caught his eye, something out of the ordinary. An elderly man, sitting alone on a bench, a small bouquet of roses clutched in his hands. The man's presence was both subtle and striking. He was dressed with an understated elegance, a beige jacket, perfectly pressed, paired with polished shoes that hinted at a lifetime of care and attention. Despite his slightly stooped posture, there was a quiet pride in the way he held himself, a dignity that seemed to shine through his aging frame. His face, though lined with age, held a softness, a gentleness that David couldn't ignore. But it was his eyes that lingered with David the longest. They were filled with a blend of anticipation and anxiety, scanning the bustling crowd as if waiting for someone who hadn't yet arrived. David felt an inexplicable pull, a curiosity he couldn't quite shake. Finally, the elderly man's gaze met his, and with a slight, courteous nod, he motioned for David to come closer. "Excuse me, young man." The elderly gentleman's voice was soft, yet clear, with a tone that hinted at a past of carefully chosen words and polite conversation. "I don't mean to bother you, but could you tell me when Flight 335 will be arriving?" David felt a flicker of surprise. He wasn't used to such politeness. In his line of work, passengers were often more hurried, more abrupt, as they navigated the rush of travel. But this man had an old-world charm, a calmness in his approach that seemed at odds with the frenzy of the airport around him. "I'm sorry, sir," David replied with a small smile. "As a security officer, I don't have access to flight schedules directly, but if you look just over there," he pointed to the large digital arrival board on the far wall, "you'll find all the arrival times listed." A wave of gratitude softened the man's face. "Thank you very much. I'm terribly sorry to have disturbed you," he said, his voice carrying a quiet urgency. "It's just that I'm waiting for someone very special, and I wouldn't want to miss her arrival for the world." The simplicity and sincerity of his words touched something within David. He found himself lingering for a moment longer, an unusual feeling stirring in his chest. "No problem at all, sir," he said warmly. "I hope you see her soon. Good luck." As David walked away to continue his rounds, he couldn't shake the image of the elderly man and his roses. There was a bittersweet quality to the encounter, a sense of timelessness that clashed with the hurried rhythm of airport life. David filed the moment away as a quiet but memorable part of his day, unaware that this fleeting interaction would soon lead him down an unexpected path, one that would change him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. David's shift ended as the day faded into a softer, gentler light. He made his way toward the exit, his mind drifting to thoughts of a warm dinner and much-needed rest. As he passed the terminal seating area, his steps slowed. There, in the same spot as earlier, sat the elderly man, still clutching the bouquet of now noticeably wilting roses. He hadn't moved. He remained just as David had left him hours ago, eyes still trained on the arrival's gate, his expression a mix of patience and hope. Unable to ignore the sight, David approached the man again. "Sir," he began cautiously, "you're still here. Hasn't your flight arrived?" The elderly man looked up, his gaze softening when he recognized David. A faint, tired smile played at his lips. "Not yet, young man. "I'm still waiting," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that hinted at a deeper story. David nodded, a surge of concern welling up within him. "May I ask who it is you're waiting for? I only ask because it's been a long time. Are you sure everything's all right?" The man paused, his hand tightening ever so slightly around the stems of the roses. "She's someone very dear to me," he said, a faraway look in his eyes. "We've been apart for a long time. I promised I'd be here to welcome her back." Something in the man's words struck David deeply. It was rare, in a world so preoccupied with movement and time, to witness such unwavering dedication. David wanted to ask more, to offer his help, perhaps even to find out if there was a misunderstanding with the flight schedules. But something held him back, a quiet respect for the old man's patience and dignity. This was clearly more than just an ordinary wait. This was a vigil of the heart, a moment only the elderly man himself fully understood. With a nod, David said, "I hope she arrives soon, sir. You take care." The man gave him a grateful nod in return, his smile faint yet filled with warmth. As David left the airport and made his way home, the image of the old man stayed with him. He couldn't shake the thought, why had the man been waiting for so long, and who was it that meant so much to him? The question lingered, weaving its way into David's thoughts as he walked through the familiar streets, the quiet evening air filled with a sense of mystery. David sat down at his kitchen table, stirring a cup of tea as steam curled softly into the air. Yet his mind was far from his quiet home. It had returned to the airport, back to the image of the elderly man sitting alone, clutching those roses as if they were the last connection he had to something, or someone precious. No matter how he tried, David couldn't shake the man's forlorn, hopeful expression. There was a story there, something deeply etched into those lines around his eyes and the curve of his quiet smile. He seemed to embody a kind of patience that David had rarely seen, a patience born of love, perhaps, or of a promise made long ago. Sighing, David took a sip of his tea, the warmth doing little to ease the unease gnawing at him. He found himself thinking about his grandmother, who had passed away a few years earlier. She'd been a woman of quiet strength, a rock in his life. But in her last years, David had seen a similar kind of loneliness settle into her eyes. She'd outlived her friends, her siblings, and even her spouse. Her world had grown smaller, more isolated, as time and loss claimed the people she loved. Sometimes, she would tell him stories of the past, of old friends and shared laughter, of promises kept and memories cherished. But behind her stories, David had sensed a profound solitude, an ache that couldn't quite be filled by family visits or phone calls. He'd watched her sit by the window, gazing out with a patient, almost wistful expression, as if she were waiting for someone who would never arrive. The image of the elderly man with the roses stirred that same feeling in David. He wondered what kind of relationship could compel someone to wait in an airport for hours, especially at his age. Was it a lover from years past? A family member long separated by distance or circumstance? Or perhaps someone he had lost and, in his own way, hoped to find again? David shook his head, feeling the weight of these questions settle heavily on his heart. He knew that the old man's wait wasn't something trivial. It was part of a story that had been years, perhaps decades in the making. It was the kind of story that, in his younger years, he might have shrugged off as old-fashioned or overly sentimental. But life had taught him differently, had shown him that the ache of waiting, of missing someone who was irreplaceable, was as real and raw as anything in this world. As he finished his tea, David felt a strange resolve building within him. Tomorrow, he'd return to the airport, just to see if the man was still there. Part of him knew he was meddling, perhaps even overstepping boundaries. But another part, a part that remembered his grandmother's silent gaze out the window. Her stories that seemed to belong to another era, couldn't let it go. He owed it to the man, to his grandmother, maybe even to himself, to ensure that this story, whatever it was, didn't end in loneliness. The following morning, David's steps quickened as he approached Silver Wind Airport, his thoughts solely focused on the elderly man. The usual sounds of bustling passengers and announcements over the intercom blended into background noise as he scanned the area for the familiar figure. A few minutes later, he spotted him, sitting in the exact same spot, his posture slightly more hunched and his shoulders drooping under the weight of what looked like a long and exhausting wait. David's heart sank. The elderly man looked even frailer in the light of a new day, the deep lines on his face sharper than he'd remembered. The bouquet of roses in his hand, already wilted yesterday, was now visibly drooping, the petals dull and soft, as if they, too, were worn from the long hours of anticipation. Yet the man's gaze was unwavering. His eyes were fixed on the arrival gate, filled with a quiet, unrelenting hope that stirred something deep within David. Taking a breath, David walked over and gently placed a hand on the man's shoulder. The elderly man looked up, and for a moment, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. Perhaps he remembered David from the night before, or maybe he was just glad for the company. Either way, his expression softened, though it was tinged with an undeniable weariness. "Good morning, sir," David said, trying to keep his tone warm but not intrusive. "I noticed you were here yesterday. Waiting? Is everything all right? Can I help you with anything?" The elderly man gave a gentle shake of his head, offering a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thank you, young man, but I'm fine. Just waiting for someone special." David felt a pang of sadness as he watched the man grip the bouquet a little tighter. He could see the resolve in the man's face, but beneath it lay exhaustion, as though each passing hour was wearing away a small piece of his spirit. David glanced at the roses, noticing the way their stems had begun to sag, the edges of the petals curling inward. In a quiet, almost whispered voice, he asked, "Are you sure they'll come, sir?" The elderly man's gaze shifted momentarily, as if he was weighing the question in his mind. He finally nodded, with a certainty that surprised David. "She will come," he said softly. "It's been a long time, but she promised. And a promise is something worth waiting for, no matter how long it takes." David's chest tightened at the man's words. It was the kind of conviction he rarely saw these days, a loyalty and dedication that felt almost from another time. Most people he knew wouldn't spend more than a few minutes waiting for someone who didn't show up. But this man had clearly been waiting for hours, maybe even days, carrying a quiet, unyielding faith that David both admired and feared. It was clear the man's hope was deeply rooted in something or someone who had touched his life in a profound way. "Is she family?" David asked gently, trying to understand more without prying too much. The elderly man paused, a glimmer of sadness crossing his eyes. "She's more than family," he said, his voice barely audible. "We grew up together, spent nearly every day by each other's side. She was the love of my life, and when we parted, she told me she'd come back for me one day. Said she'd find me, no matter how long it took." David's heart ached at the story. He thought about all the people he'd seen part ways at the airport, their goodbyes often rushed and thoughtless, as though they expected to see each other again soon. This man's farewell, though, must have been something deeper, something he had carried with him for years. And now, as he sat waiting, his faith unbroken, David realized just how much hope had sustained him through all that time. David wanted to say something comforting, to reassure the man in some way, but he knew words alone wouldn't bridge the gap between them. So instead, he decided to sit down beside him, offering his silent company. After a moment, the elderly man looked at David, his expression softening as he accepted the unspoken gesture of support. For a while, they sat together in silence, watching as passengers came and went. David noticed the way the man's gaze would light up each time someone appeared in the arrival hall, only to dim slightly when it wasn't the face he was waiting for. Finally, David broke the silence. "I don't know who she is, sir, but anyone worth this kind of wait must be someone truly special. I hope she arrives soon." The elderly man smiled, his eyes shining with a gratitude that David didn't expect. "Thank you, son," he said softly. "It means a lot to know there are still people who understand." David watched as the man's eyes returned to the arrival gate, his expression once again filled with that unshakable determination to wait, no matter how many more hours or days might pass. And as he sat there, David realized that this wasn't just about a reunion. It was about fulfilling a promise, honoring a love that had withstood the test of time. It was a testament to the power of memory and the strength of a heart that refused to forget. When David finally stood to leave, he felt a profound respect for the man, a respect that extended beyond words. He promised himself he would check on him again, as often as he could, just to make sure he wasn't alone in his wait. And as he walked away, he couldn't help but hope with all his heart that the woman the man was waiting for would finally step through those doors. Because in a world that often forgot the value of promises, this man had held on, faithfully, patiently, and without regret. And David, in his own small way, wanted to honor that. David returned to the airport early the next morning, now genuinely concerned about the elderly man he'd come to know in these brief but meaningful encounters. He had spent the night turning over the man's story in his mind, trying to piece together the fragments of hope and waiting he had witnessed. There was something that didn't sit right, a nagging feeling that there was more to the story than the elderly man had revealed. As he approached the spot by the arrivals gate, David saw the man once again, sitting with his bouquet, looking as steadfast as ever. The roses were now mostly brown, the petals wilting and falling apart, yet the man held on to them with the same sense of purpose, his eyes fixed with hopeful longing on the arrival doors. David took a deep breath and walked over, feeling a sense of duty to uncover what was truly going on. "Good morning, sir," he greeted, his voice gentle but firm. "You're here again, waiting. Do you mind if I join you for a little while?" The elderly man nodded, offering David a tired but appreciative smile. "Of course, son. It's good to have some company." There was a brief pause before he added, "You've been very kind. Not many people notice. People like me." David hesitated before asking, "If you don't mind me asking, who exactly is it you're waiting for? I know you've mentioned she's someone special, someone from your past, but I want to understand, if that's all right." The man's gaze faltered for a moment, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. But then he nodded, as if deciding it was time to share the truth. "I suppose I owe you the full story, given how you've looked out for me." He leaned forward, his hands clutching the bouquet with a gentle but anxious grip. "I'm waiting for my girlfriend. Well, we haven't actually met in person yet, but we've been talking for quite some time online. She lives far away in Africa." David's heart skipped a beat. He felt a sense of dread settle over him, though he tried to keep his expression calm and attentive. "I see. So you've never actually met in person?" "No," the man admitted, a shy smile crossing his face. "But we've shared so many messages, and she's told me so much about her life, her dreams. We've talked about everything, really. I feel like I know her." His eyes brightened as he spoke, as if picturing the woman he believed he'd come to love. "She was supposed to arrive a few days ago. Said she'd finally come and we could start our life together. She sounded so happy." David struggled to find the right words. He glanced around, noting the cautious eyes of some of his colleagues who were stationed nearby, sensing that this was the moment to approach the situation carefully. "And? Has she asked you for anything, sir? Like help, financially, or anything else?" The elderly man hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the rose petals. "Well, she's had some difficulties. Life hasn't been easy for her. I sent her some money here and there. Not much, just what I could spare. She told me it was for travel expenses to help her reach me." David felt his stomach drop. The scenario unfolding before him was painfully clear, but he didn't want to break the elderly man's heart or shake his faith all at once. He needed to be gentle, yet firm enough to prevent a devastating outcome. "Sir, I want to be honest with you," David began, his tone soft but steady. "There are some people out there who take advantage of others' kindness and trust. And sometimes they use the internet to pretend to be someone they're not, to build relationships that aren't entirely real." He paused, watching the man's reaction closely. "Have you considered that this might be one of those situations?" The elderly man's expression faltered, a look of confusion and worry creeping into his eyes. He looked down at the roses, his fingers trembling slightly. You think she's not real?" David nodded carefully. "I can't say for sure, sir, but I think it's possible that this woman may not be who she says she is. There have been cases where people, kind people, end up being deceived by someone they thought they could trust." The man's face grew pale, his gaze dropping to the floor as he absorbed David's words. The hopeful sparkle that had lit up his eyes seemed to dim, replaced by an expression of disbelief and grief. He swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. "But she shared so many things. We talked about our future together. I even brought money to help her get settled here. She said she'd need it for a place to stay, for a new life." David felt his chest tighten. This man, so full of trust and genuine affection, was on the verge of being hurt in a way that would be difficult to heal. David knew he had to act quickly. Discreetly, he signaled one of his colleagues who worked in airport security and had experience with cases involving potential scams to assist with the situation. As his colleague approached, David continued, "Sir, please don't blame yourself. You're a kind person, and it's natural to want to believe in someone you care about. But sometimes these things, they're not what they seem. We're here to help you, to make sure that you're safe." The elderly man's shoulders slumped, the weight of disappointment settling heavily on him. He looked at the bouquet in his hands, his fingers gently brushing over the withered petals. I thought she loved me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I thought we'd finally found each other after all these years." David placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, offering him a gentle squeeze. "You're not alone in this. Many good people have been in the same position, and it doesn't make you foolish. It just means you have a good heart." His colleague stepped forward, gently explaining that they would look into the woman's supposed travel information to verify the situation. They assured the man that they would handle it with discretion and that they would keep him informed every step of the way. The elderly man nodded numbly, his eyes still fixed on the bouquet. There was an air of profound sadness in his demeanor, but somewhere, beneath the sadness, David could see a small glimmer of relief. It was as if a part of him had always feared that this might be the truth, but hadn't wanted to face it alone. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice shaking. I don't know what I would have done without you all. I just wanted to believe in something again." David's heart ached as he watched the man's frail fingers loosen their grip on the bouquet, the last petal slipping from his hand and fluttering softly to the floor. He promised himself that he would be there for the man, to help him through the difficult days ahead, to make sure he knew he wasn't alone. And as he left the elderly man in the capable hands of his colleagues, David couldn't help but feel a profound respect for him. A man whose hope had been exploited, but who, even in his sorrow, had a dignity and grace that inspired everyone around him. The morning unfolded in a way David had not anticipated, filling the airport with a strange tension. He was stationed near the entrance with his team, quietly monitoring the flow of passengers. His heart raced as he watched for any suspicious figures who might be part of the scam. Just as he was discussing strategy with his colleagues, he caught a glimpse of the elderly man seated a short distance away, still clutching his withered bouquet. Despite his heartbreak, the man's hopeful gaze had returned, and his hands shook as he stared at his phone, his face lighting up as a new message appeared. David's stomach twisted. He saw the man's lips moving silently as he read the message, his eyes filled with relief and excitement. She's here at last," he murmured to himself, his voice barely audible yet brimming with hope. David couldn't hear the words, but could sense the shift in the man's demeanor. After all the disappointment, the elderly man seemed to have rekindled that spark of faith he'd carried so stubbornly. The old man began to rise from his seat, straightening his back with renewed energy. David stepped forward, his heart heavy with dread. He knew the message was just another deceitful ploy. He exchanged a glance with his colleagues, who subtly signaled their readiness to act. But the elderly man was lost in his own world, his hope blinding him to everything around him. He smoothed his shirt, his hands trembling with a mix of nervousness and excitement as he glanced around, searching the faces of new arrivals. "She's here," he whispered to himself, as if saying it aloud would make it real. Just then, David's radio buzzed softly in his ear. One of his colleagues had spotted two individuals who matched the description of suspected scammers, loitering near the arrival's exit. They were a young couple, dressed casually, with an air of impatience and alertness that made them stand out. The woman glanced around nervously, while the man kept checking his phone, a sly smile flickering across his face. It was obvious they were looking for someone, a target they intended to deceive. David felt his pulse quicken. He gestured to his team, and they moved into position. He approached the elderly man gently, placing a firm but compassionate hand on his shoulder. "Sir, please wait a moment," David said softly, his tone filled with both urgency and understanding. "I believe those people may be the ones you've been, waiting for. But I need you to stay here. Let us handle this." The elderly man looked at him, confusion and hurt flashing in his eyes. "But she's here, David. She messaged me just now. She said she's waiting for me just past those doors." David's expression softened, and he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I know, sir. I know this is hard. But please, trust me. I don't want you to get hurt any more than you already have." The old man's face fell, the weight of realization starting to seep into his features as he looked toward the arrival's gate. His eyes wavered between hope and despair, the truth beginning to settle in. But he nodded, reluctantly stepping back. With a quick signal, David and his team moved in on the couple. The two scammers were caught off guard, their expressions twisting from feigned innocence to panic as they realized the ruse had been uncovered. David's colleague approached the woman first, calmly but firmly questioning her. She stammered, her gaze darting back and forth, searching for an escape. Meanwhile, the man tried to step away casually, as if to disappear into the crowd, but David intercepted him, his posture authoritative. The confrontation was subtle, but charged. In a matter of minutes, the truth unraveled. The young woman admitted to posing as the elderly man's online girlfriend, weaving stories of hardship and distant affection to gain his sympathy and money. She had strung him along, feeding his loneliness with lies and empty promises. Each message had been carefully crafted, every interaction calculated to extract more money under the guise of love and companionship. The elderly man watched from a distance, his face growing paler with each revelation. His shoulders slumped, and he looked down at the wilted roses in his hands, the truth hitting him like a storm he'd tried to outrun. It was as though the last traces of hope were being drained from his heart, leaving a painful emptiness behind. When the scammers were finally detained, David returned to the elderly man, his own heart heavy with sorrow. He struggled to find the right words, knowing that no amount of sympathy could ease the man's pain. But he needed him to understand that he wasn't alone, that he hadn't lost everything. The old man's voice trembled as he spoke, his gaze fixed on the ground. I thought she was different. I thought she cared about me. I really believed I'd finally found someone who saw me." His words faltered, choked with grief. He looked up at David, his eyes brimming with tears that he was too proud to let fall. "Why did she do this? I just wanted someone to talk to spend time with. I didn't think. David placed a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. "I'm so sorry, sir. There are people in this world who prey on kindness, who take advantage of good-hearted people like you. But that doesn't mean everyone is like that. You deserve someone who truly values you, who sees the person you are." The elderly man's grip tightened on the roses, their brittle petals crumbling under the pressure of his fingers. His voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust anyone again. It's too hard. It hurts too much." David nodded, understanding the depth of his sorrow. "I know it feels that way now, but don't let this experience define what you deserve. You are worthy of genuine kindness and companionship. You deserve someone who cares for you without conditions." For a long moment, they stood together in silence, the bustle of the airport fading into the background. The elderly man's face softened, and though his eyes were filled with sorrow, there was a glimmer of resilience that hadn't been there before, a spark of strength amidst the broken pieces of his trust. Finally, he released the wilted bouquet, letting it fall to the floor. The sight of the faded roses scattered at his feet seemed to symbolize a letting go, a small act of release from the pain of his shattered hopes. He straightened, the lines on his face etched deeper by grief, but tempered by a newfound strength. "Thank you, David," he murmured. "Thank you for caring, for stopping me before it got worse." David nodded, offering a small, sad smile. "Anytime. Remember, you're not alone. There are people who genuinely care about you, even if they're not the ones you expected." With a final nod, the elderly man turned away, moving slowly through the airport doors. His steps were heavier, his gaze lower, but he carried with him a dignity and resilience that even the most painful betrayal could not erase. David watched him go, hoping that one day the old man would find the true companionship he so deeply deserved. And as he returned to his post, he made a silent promise to himself. He would always look out for the vulnerable, for those whose trust had been betrayed, because sometimes A small act of kindness could make all the difference in a world that could be as cruel as it was beautiful. David found the elderly man outside the airport, sitting alone on a cold bench by the taxi stand. The man's head was bowed, his shoulders slumped forward, as if the weight of betrayal had pulled him deeper into himself. The scene tugged painfully at David's heart. He could see the man's hand tremble slightly as it rested on his knee, his knuckles pale from the pressure he applied, trying to steady himself. David approached quietly, his footsteps light, and took a seat beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air filled only with the low hum of passing cars and distant voices. Then, David placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. "You don't have to face this alone," David said softly. The man looked up, his eyes red and brimming with unshed tears. He blinked quickly, trying to hold back his emotions, but the pain etched across his face was unmistakable. "I feel so foolish," the man finally whispered, his voice cracking. "To think I let myself believe in something so impossible. I should have known better." His gaze dropped to his hands, which lay empty now, stripped even of the roses he'd clung to so desperately. "I feel like a child who's been tricked. At my age, I thought I'd seen enough of life to know better." David shook his head, his voice calm and steady. "There's no shame in wanting companionship, in opening your heart to someone. That desire for connection doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human. We all need to feel understood and valued. There's nothing wrong with that." The elderly man swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening as he struggled to contain his sorrow. "But what kind of person am I if I was so easily deceived? What does that say about me?" "It says you have a good heart," David replied, his voice warm with empathy. "It says you believe in the goodness of people, and that's not a weakness. The only shame would be in letting this experience make you hard and distrustful. You don't deserve that, and neither do the people who genuinely care about you." The man was silent, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the parking lot. David waited, letting him process the words, hoping they would offer some comfort. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice barely audible. It's been so long since I felt like I mattered to anyone. My wife passed years ago, and my children have their own lives now. The days blend into each other, and I thought, maybe this was my chance to feel alive again, to share my life with someone. But now, I don't know if I'll ever feel that way again." David's heart ached for him. He could hear the loneliness buried beneath the words, the silent yearning of a man who had once had love and companionship, but now drifted through life without an anchor. David knew that feeling well. He'd seen it in his own grandmother's eyes after his grandfather had passed. She had often spoken of the emptiness that filled her days, despite the visits and calls from family. "Losing trust in someone who deceived you isn't the same as losing faith in everyone," David said gently. "Trusting others isn't a mistake, and your kindness and openness are qualities the world needs more of. Please don't let someone else's cruelty steal that from you." The elderly man looked at him, his expression softening slightly as he processed the words. "I want to believe that, but right now, I just feel so small, so insignificant." David nodded in understanding, his gaze steady and reassuring. "That feeling is valid, and it's okay to feel hurt and vulnerable. But you don't have to carry this alone. There are people who can help you work through this pain, therapists and counselors who specialize in situations like these. Talking to a professional could help you process these emotions in a healthy way. It doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're strong enough to seek support." The man's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "You think it would help? Talking to someone about all this?" "I do," David said firmly. "And it might be uncomfortable at first, but you'll be taking control of your healing. You deserve a safe place to share your feelings without judgment. There's no need to bear this alone." For a moment, the man seemed lost in thought, his face softening as he considered the possibility. Perhaps you're right. It's been so long since I've opened up to anyone. I've forgotten what it feels like to have someone truly listen." David smiled softly. "We all need someone to listen, no matter how old or wise we are. And just because you've lived a full life doesn't mean there aren't people out there who care deeply about your well-being." The elderly man looked at David with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. It's hard to believe that someone so young could understand this kind of pain. David chuckled gently, his tone light yet sincere. Pain doesn't care about age. We all feel it. And if I can offer a bit of comfort, then I'm glad to do so. He paused, his gaze turning serious. I'd like to stay in touch, if that's okay with you. Just to check in every now and then. You're not alone, and I want you to feel that someone cares. The man's face softened, his eyes shining with gratitude. He nodded, a faint smile lifting the corners of his mouth. That would mean a lot to me, David. Truly, it would. I thought the world had forgotten about people like me. Not at all, David assured him. Respect doesn't fade with age. You have a lifetime of experiences that younger people like me can learn from. We need your wisdom, and we need you to know that you matter. The old man's eyes misted with tears, but this time they weren't tears of pain. There was a hint of hope in his gaze, a quiet gratitude for the kindness he hadn't expected to find. Thank you, David, he murmured, his voice trembling. You've given me something I thought I'd lost, a sense of dignity. David gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. That dignity is yours, sir. No one can take it away from you. And whenever you feel alone, remember, there are people who respect you, who want to hear your stories, who value you for who you are. The two of them sat in comfortable silence, the city sounds fading into the background as a sense of peace settled between them. David knew that the road ahead for the elderly man would still be challenging, that healing would take time. But he also knew that the man wouldn't face that road alone. As they parted ways, David made a silent promise to himself. He would check in on this man, make sure he had someone to talk to, and ensure that the dignity and kindness the world so often overlooked would be cherished and respected. And for the elderly man, the pain of betrayal would remain, but alongside it was a renewed sense of hope, a quiet, steady belief that he hadn't been abandoned by the world. There were still people who cared, who valued his presence, and who saw in him not just a man deceived, but a man worthy of compassion and respect. As David walked back into the airport, he knew that he, too, had been changed by the encounter. In a world often filled with haste and indifference, he'd found a reason to slow down, to notice, to care. And he knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning of a friendship that would transcend both age and circumstance. As time passed, David and the elderly man, whom he now called Mr. Brooks, kept in touch, their unlikely friendship blossoming into something meaningful for both of them. David made a point to call Mr. Brooks regularly, inviting him to join him for coffee, watch a game together, or simply chat about life's ups and downs. In return, Mr. Brooks shared stories of his youth, his travels, and the lessons he'd learned along the way. Through these moments, David found himself looking up to Mr. Brooks, valuing his wisdom and the life experiences he shared so openly. For Mr. Brooks, David became more than just a young man who had shown kindness. David had become a bridge to a world that had seemed cold and distant. With his renewed faith in human connection, he felt a sense of belonging again, a reminder that even in life's later chapters, one could find purpose and companionship. The pain of betrayal faded, replaced by the warmth of friendship and the quiet reassurance that he was not alone. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, Mr. Brooks turned to David, gratitude shining in his eyes. You know, I thought my story was ending, but you've reminded me that there are always new chapters waiting to be written. Thank you, David. You've given me more than you'll ever know. David smiled, squeezing his shoulder gently. We're all part of each other's stories, Mr. Brooks. I'm just glad to be part of yours. As their laughter filled the air, David knew that the kindness he had shown had not only healed an old man's heart, but had also enriched his own life in ways he'd never anticipated. If you've watched this story all the way to the end, we hope it resonated with you. Please support us by giving a like, hitting the subscribe button, and sharing it with friends and family. Your comments mean a lot to us, so feel free to share your thoughts and let us know what moved you the most. Every like, sub, share, and comment helps us continue bringing meaningful stories like this to you. Thank you for being part of our journey.